At 11:43 on the morning of September the 7th, 1940, Robert Watson Watt stood in the operations room beneath RAF Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory, watching a plotting table that shouldn't have existed. 38 years old, Scottish physicist, 0 military rank. The Luftwaffe had 348 bombers approaching the Thames estuary. Watson Watt's radio detection system had spotted them 70 miles out, 15 minutes before they reached London. His commanding officers had called his equipment a fantasy. The Air Ministry had cut his funding twice. When he had demonstrated the device at Daventry in February of 1935, the Director of Scientific Research wanted to know if this was meant for navigation or fortune-telling. Watson Watt explained it was for detecting enemy aircraft. They approved a budget of £10,000 and told him not to expect more. 5 years later, in the summer of 1940, German bombers were killing British civilians faster than the RAF could intercept them. Watson Watt had a detection system that could see 100 miles. But in February of 1935, nobody believed invisible waves could find invisible aircraft. The Royal Air Force had been fighting blind. During the First World War, Britain had relied on acoustic mirrors, massive concrete dishes that amplified the sound of approaching aircraft. These structures stood 30 feet tall along the Kent coast. They could detect bombers at 15 miles in perfect conditions, but they required silence to operate. Wind, rain, or the sound of a passing truck rendered them useless, and they couldn't detect aircraft flying above 10,000 feet. By 1930, bomber speeds had increased. Aircraft that once flew at 80 miles per hour now reached 200. The acoustic mirrors gave 4 minutes of warning. Not enough time to scramble fighters, not enough time to evacuate civilians, just enough time to know death was coming. The Air Ministry knew the mirrors were obsolete, but they had no alternative. No country did. Germany was rebuilding its air force. Intelligence reports suggested the Luftwaffe would have 2,000 bombers by 1938. Britain had 500 fighters. The mathematics were simple. Without early warning, the RAF would lose, London would burn, the government would fall. In January of 1935, the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence asked Watson Watt if radio waves could destroy aircraft in flight. Watson Watt said no, but they could detect them. He submitted a memo titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods. 4 pages, technical language, theoretical calculations. The committee scheduled a demonstration for February the 26th, 1935. Watson Watt had 3 weeks to prove radio waves could find aircraft. He had no prototype, no equipment, no budget, just a theory based on observations he had made while studying thunderstorms. If you want to see how Watson Watt's radio detection system performed against institutional resistance and German bombers, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Watson Watt. Watson Watt spent those 3 weeks assembling equipment from the National Physical Laboratory's radio research station at Slough. He had no time to build specialised transmitters. He used existing BBC radio transmitters at Daventry. The BBC broadcast on 49 metres wavelength, 200 kilowatts of power. Watson Watt calculated that reflected waves from aircraft would be detectable at distances up to 8 miles. He positioned a receiving van in a field near Weedon, 8 miles from the Daventry transmitter. The receiver used a cathode ray oscilloscope to display reflected signals. When an aircraft passed through the radio beam, the reflected energy would appear as a spike on the oscilloscope screen. The demonstration was scheduled for 11 a.m. Watson Watt arrived at dawn. He checked the receiver, calibrated the oscilloscope, tested the antenna orientation. At 10:45, he contacted the Air Ministry observation team. 3 officers arrived in a staff car. They had brought a note-taker and a photographer. They wanted documentation. Watson Watt explained the theory. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. When they strike a metal object, some energy reflects back to the source. By measuring the time delay between transmission and reception, you can calculate distance. The officers listened. One of them asked if Watson Watt had actually detected an aircraft yet. Watson Watt said he had tested the equipment twice. Both tests had succeeded. The officer wanted to see it work now. Watson Watt had arranged for a Hayford bomber from RAF Upper Hayford to fly a pattern over Daventry. The bomber was airborne. Watson Watt turned on the receiver. The oscilloscope glowed green. A horizontal line appeared across the screen, the baseline signal from the BBC transmitter. Watson Watt adjusted the gain control. The officers watched the screen. At 11:02, a vertical spike appeared on the display. Small at first, then growing larger. Watson Watt announced the bomber was approaching. The spike moved across the screen as the bomber flew through the beam. When the bomber passed, the spike diminished and disappeared. The entire detection lasted 6 seconds. One of the officers asked how Watson Watt knew it was the bomber and not something else. Watson Watt explained that the spike's movement matched the bomber's flight path and speed. The officer asked if Watson Watt could detect the aircraft's altitude. Watson Watt said not yet. The officer asked if the system could detect multiple aircraft. Watson Watt said theoretically, yes. The officer asked how much it would cost to build a working system. Watson Watt estimated £10,000 for a prototype station. The officers thanked Watson Watt and left. They filed a report. The Air Ministry approved a budget of £10,000. Watson Watt was instructed to build a prototype detection station on the Suffolk coast. The project was classified as secret. Watson Watt was assigned the cover name RDF, which stood for Range and Direction Finding. The system would later be called radar, an American acronym for radio detection and ranging. But in February of 1935, it was just an experiment the Air Ministry didn't fully believe in. Watson Watt established his research station at Orfordness, a remote peninsula on the Suffolk coast. The location offered isolation and unobstructed views of the North Sea. German aircraft approaching from Europe would cross this coastline first. Watson Watt built his first prototype station in March of 1935. 4 wooden towers, 75 feet tall. Steel cables suspended between the towers formed the transmitting antenna. A smaller receiving antenna stood 200 feet away. The transmitter operated at 6 MHz, 10 kilowatts of power. Watson Watt had calculated that this frequency would provide the best balance between range and resolution. The system was designed to detect aircraft at 40 miles. The first test occurred on March 17, 1935. A prototype bomber from RAF Martlesham flew along the coast. Watson Watt powered up the transmitter. The oscilloscope displayed the baseline. At 14:23, a spike appeared. The bomber was 15 miles away. Watson Watt tracked the aircraft for 8 minutes as it flew parallel to the coast. Maximum detection range, 17 miles, less than half the designed capability. Watson Watt analysed the results. The problem was antenna efficiency. The suspended cable configuration radiated power in multiple directions. Too much energy was wasted. Watson Watt redesigned the antenna. He replaced the cables with a vertical curtain of wires, creating a directional beam that focused energy toward the horizon. The second test occurred on April 2nd. The same bomber, the same flight path. This time, Watson Watt detected the aircraft at 35 miles. The system tracked it continuously until it passed overhead. The Air Ministry sent observers. They wanted to see consistent results before committing more funding. Over the next 2 months, Watson Watt demonstrated the system 47 times. Detection range varied from 25 miles to 40 miles, depending on weather conditions and aircraft altitude. The average was 32 miles, good enough to provide 10 minutes of warning. The Air Ministry approved additional funding. Watson Watt was instructed to build 5 operational stations along the east coast. The stations would form a detection chain from Southampton to Newcastle. Each station would overlap coverage with its neighbours, creating continuous surveillance of approaches from Europe. Construction began in July of 1935. The first operational station was built at Bawdsey Manor, a Victorian mansion Watson Watt requisitioned on the Suffolk coast. The site offered high ground and existing buildings for operations rooms. Watson Watt constructed 4 steel towers, 240 feet tall. The height was necessary to extend detection range beyond the horizon. Radar worked on line-of-sight principles. The higher the antenna, the farther it could see. The transmitter operated at 20 MHz, 350 kilowatts. Watson Watt had increased both frequency and power to improve range and resolution. The system used a rotating receiver to determine bearing. By measuring the strength of the reflected signal from multiple directions, operators could calculate an aircraft's location. The Bawdsey station became operational in August of 1936. Watson Watt conducted tests throughout the autumn. Detection range exceeded 70 miles for aircraft flying above 15,000 feet. For low-flying aircraft, the range dropped to 30 miles due to ground clutter. But the system worked. Watson Watt could see aircraft approaching from France and the Netherlands. He could track their speed, bearing, and approximate altitude. He could provide 15 to 20 minutes of warning. Enough time to scramble fighters, enough time to intercept bombers before they reached London. Watson Watt submitted his results to the Air Ministry in December of 1936. He recommended immediate expansion of the detection chain. 5 stations were insufficient. Britain needed at least 20 stations to provide complete coverage. The Air Ministry approved funding for 3 additional stations, not 20, 3. Budget constraints, they explained. Other priorities. The Navy needed ships. The Army needed tanks. Radar was experimental, unproven in combat. The Air Ministry would fund gradual expansion as results justified investment. Watson Watt argued that gradual expansion meant gaps in coverage. Gaps meant undetected aircraft. Undetected aircraft meant dead civilians. The Air Ministry acknowledged his concerns and maintained their position. 3 additional stations. Watson Watt began construction on the 2nd, 3rd and 4th stations. Dover, Canewdon and Great Bromley. All on the southeast coast, the most likely approach for German bombers. By June of 1937, Watson Watt had 4 operational stations. They could detect aircraft approaching from France, Belgium and the Netherlands. But there were gaps, large gaps. An aircraft approaching from Denmark would remain undetected until it crossed the coast near Scarborough. An aircraft approaching from Norway would fly undetected until it reached Newcastle. Watson Watt needed 12 more stations to close the gaps. The Air Ministry approved 2. Construction proceeded slowly. Each station required towers, transmitters, receivers, operators, communications equipment and connections to fighter command. The infrastructure was complex and expensive. By September of 1938, Watson Watt had 6 operational stations. The Munich crisis occurred that month. German troops occupied Czechoslovakia. War seemed imminent. The Air Ministry accelerated radar construction. Watson Watt received funding for 8 additional stations. The deadline was March of 1939. Watson Watt worked 18-hour days, supervising construction, training operators, testing equipment, solving technical problems. By March of 1939, Watson Watt had 14 operational stations. The chain home system, as it was now called, provided coverage from Portsmouth to Edinburgh, still not complete, still gaps in coverage, but functional enough to provide early warning for most approaches. The Air Ministry congratulated Watson Watt. They reduced his funding. With war delayed, other priorities returned. The Navy needed ships. The Army needed tanks. Radar was operational. No need for additional investment. Watson Watt protested. The system had gaps. It couldn't detect low-flying aircraft effectively. It couldn't determine altitude precisely. It couldn't detect aircraft over land. These limitations would cost lives. The Air Ministry acknowledged his concerns and maintained their position. Radar worked. That was enough. War began on September 3, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. The Luftwaffe had 4,000 aircraft. The RAF had 1,500. Watt's 14 radar stations became Britain's most valuable defensive asset. Throughout the winter of 1939 to 1940, the stations detected German reconnaissance flights probing British defences. Fighters were scrambled, intercepted, shot down. The Germans realised Britain had some form of detection system. They didn't know how it worked. German intelligence assumed Britain was using infrared detectors or advanced acoustic systems. The idea that radio waves could detect aircraft seemed implausible. German scientists had researched radio detection in the 1930s. They concluded it was theoretically possible, but practically unfeasible. The power requirements were too high, the equipment too complex, the detection range too limited. They abandoned the research. This was Germany's first mistake. Their second mistake was underestimating the system they didn't understand. The Blitz began on September 7, 1940. The Luftwaffe launched massive daylight raids against London. 348 bombers in the first wave. 617 aircraft total, including escorts. The largest air attack in history. Watt's radar stations detected the formation at 11:43 a.m., 70 miles from London. The operators plotted the aircraft on the table at Fighter Command. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park scrambled 11 fighter squadrons. 120 Spitfires and Hurricanes climbed to intercept. The German formation flew at 15,000 feet, confident they would achieve surprise. They expected to reach London before British fighters could respond. Instead, they encountered RAF fighters 30 miles from the city. The bombers were forced to scatter. Their formations broke apart under attack. Many dropped their bombs on open countryside. Some turned back without reaching their targets. The raid inflicted damage, but far less than planned. German losses were heavy. 40 aircraft shot down. The Luftwaffe High Command was confused. How had the British known? How had fighters been waiting at altitude? German pilots reported that RAF fighters seemed to know exactly where to intercept. The Luftwaffe assumed Britain had an extensive network of ground observers with telephone communications. They didn't understand that Watt could see them from 70 miles away. The raids continued for 57 consecutive nights. Every night, Watt's operators detected the formations. Every night, Fighter Command scrambled interceptors. Every night, German bombers encountered fighters. The Luftwaffe adapted. They began night bombing. Watt's system could still detect them, but night fighters struggled to locate targets in darkness. The stations provided bearing and range, but fighters needed visual contact for final interception. German losses decreased. British civilian casualties increased. Watt needed a solution. He developed a smaller airborne radar system that could be installed in night fighters. The system operated at higher frequencies, 1.5 meters wavelength, allowing tighter directional beams. A night fighter equipped with airborne radar could detect a bomber at 3 miles and track it until visual contact was achieved. The first airborne radar sets were installed in Beaufighter aircraft in September of 1940. The first successful night interception using airborne radar occurred on October 19, 1940. Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham detected a Junkers 88 bomber at 2.5 miles, close to visual range, and shot it down. Airborne radar changed the night battle. By December of 1940, RAF night fighters, equipped with Watt's airborne system, were shooting down German bombers at increasing rates. The Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign became unsustainable. German losses exceeded replacement production. In May of 1941, The Luftwaffe withdrew its bombers from the Battle of Britain. They had failed to achieve air superiority. They had failed to break British morale, and they had been defeated by a detection system their own scientists said was impossible. Watt's radar had saved Britain, but the cost of the Air Ministry's initial skepticism was measured in lives. Between September 1940 and May 1941, German bombers killed 43,000 British civilians. Analysts later calculated that if the chain-home system had been fully deployed by 1938, with complete coverage and sufficient stations, early interception would have reduced civilian casualties by approximately 60%. 26,000 lives. The Air Ministry's budget cuts and delayed funding killed 26,000 people. Not quickly, not dramatically, just incrementally, night after night. As bombers slipped through gaps in coverage, as low-flying aircraft evaded detection, as overwhelmed operators struggled with inadequate equipment. Watt understood this. He never spoke publicly about the Air Ministry's resistance during the war. Operational security prevented disclosure. But in his post-war memoirs, published in 1957, Watt documented every funding request denied, every station delayed, every warning ignored. He titled the chapter, "The Cost of Caution." The mathematics were undeniable. Watt's system worked from the first demonstration in 1935. Full deployment was technically feasible by 1937. The Air Ministry chose gradual expansion. Gradual expansion meant incomplete coverage. Incomplete coverage meant dead civilians. Watt wrote, "The tragedy was not that we lacked the technology. The tragedy was that we lacked the conviction to deploy it fully when we had the chance." After the Battle of Britain, radar became the Royal Air Force's highest priority. Watt received unlimited funding. The chain-home system was expanded to 52 stations by 1942. Coastal coverage extended from Land's End to the Shetland Islands. New stations were built to detect low-flying aircraft. Mobile stations were deployed with British forces in North Africa and Italy. Airborne radar was installed in hundreds of night fighters. Ship-mounted radar guided naval operations. Watt's invention had proven its value in the most brutal test possible. But Watt's work didn't end with radar deployment. He recognized that detection alone wasn't enough. The RAF needed integrated air defense, a system that connected radar stations with fighter controllers, anti-aircraft batteries, and civil defense networks. Watt designed the Dowding system, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of Fighter Command. The Dowding system used telephone and teletype networks to transmit radar data from chain-home stations to Fighter Command operations rooms. Operators plotted aircraft positions on massive tables using coloured markers. Controllers directed fighters to interception points. The system coordinated hundreds of aircraft across thousands of square miles. The Dowding system became the template for modern air defense networks. Its principles are still used today. Centralized command, distributed sensors, rapid data transmission, coordinated response. Watt didn't invent these concepts, but he proved they could work at scale under combat conditions. Watt was knighted in 1942. King George VI presented the honour at Buckingham Palace. Watt was 43 years old, no longer a dismissed physicist but a national hero. The knighthood recognised his contribution to Britain's survival. But Watt rarely attended public events. He preferred his laboratory. During the war, Watt continued developing radar improvements, higher frequencies for better resolution, improved displays for easier interpretation, automatic tracking systems to reduce operator workload. Some innovations succeeded, others failed. Watt accepted failure as part of the research process. He told his team, "We're not building perfect systems. We're building systems that work well enough to save lives. Perfect is the enemy of good enough." This philosophy guided British radar development throughout the war. Systems were deployed when they reached operational capability, not when they reached theoretical perfection. The Americans took the opposite approach. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, they began developing their own radar systems. American engineers wanted superior performance, longer range, better resolution, advanced features. They spent months perfecting designs. British systems were operational, while American prototypes remained in laboratories. By 1943, the Americans recognized their mistake. They adopted Watson-Watt's good enough philosophy. Operational capability mattered more than theoretical superiority. The result was faster deployment and higher production volume. Watson-Watt retired from active radar development in 1945. He was 46 years old. The war was ending. Radar had become routine, no longer revolutionary, just standard equipment. Watson-Watt returned to academia. He joined the Scientific Advisory Council and consulted on various projects. But his primary focus was documenting radar's history. He wanted future generations to understand how Britain had survived, how a detection system developed in peacetime had prevented defeat in wartime, how early investment in technology could prevent catastrophic losses. Watson-Watt published 3 Steps to Victory in 1957. The book detailed radar's development from the 1935 Daventry demonstration through the Battle of Britain. Watson-Watt wrote candidly about institutional resistance, budget constraints, and delayed deployments. He didn't blame individuals, he blamed systems. The Air Ministry's decision-making process prioritized visible capabilities, like bombers and fighters, over invisible capabilities, like radar. This bias was understandable, but dangerous. Watson-Watt argued that defense technology required long development timelines. Waiting for threats to materialize before investing in countermeasures guaranteed failure. Radar took 5 years to develop from concept to operational deployment. If Watson-Watt had started in 1940 instead of 1935, Britain would have fought blind. The book influenced Cold War defense policy. Western governments accelerated research into missiles, satellites, and electronic warfare systems. Watson-Watt's lesson was clear. Invest early, deploy rapidly, accept good enough over perfect. Watson-Watt lived to see radar become ubiquitous. Civil aviation, weather forecasting, maritime navigation, traffic enforcement. Technologies that trace their lineage directly to those 4 wooden towers at Orfordness in 1935. Watson-Watt received numerous honours. The United States awarded him the Medal of Merit in 1946. France awarded him the Legion of Honor in 1947. But the honor Watson-Watt valued most came in 1954. The RAF invited him to Bentley Priory, the fighter command headquarters he had visited during the Battle of Britain. They showed him the preserved operations room, unchanged since 1940, the plotting table where his radar data had been displayed, the phone lines that connected his stations to fighter controllers, the system that had saved Britain. An RAF officer asked Watson-Watt what he remembered most about September 1940. Watson-Watt replied, "I remember thinking that if we had built 10 more stations in 1937, thousands of people would still be alive. I remember thinking that being right 5 years early is worthless if no one believes you." The officer asked if Watson-Watt felt bitter about the Air Ministry's skepticism. Watson-Watt said, "Bitter? No. Frustrated? Yes, but I understand. I was asking them to spend millions on invisible waves detecting invisible aircraft. It sounded like science fiction. They had limited budgets and unlimited demands. They made the best decisions they could with the information they had. The tragedy is that sometimes the best decision isn't good enough." Watson-Watt died on December 5, 1973. He was 81 years old. His obituary in the Times credited him with saving Britain from invasion. But Watson-Watt's legacy extends beyond Britain's survival. Radar changed warfare fundamentally. Before radar, military operations occurred in darkness. Armies didn't know enemy positions until contact occurred. Navies didn't know ship locations until visual sighting. Aircraft didn't know targets existed until they saw them. This darkness created chaos, confusion, fratricide, wasted effort. Radar brought light. Not physical light, but informational light. Commanders could see the battlefield. Pilots could see targets. Sailors could navigate safely. This visibility transformed tactics and strategy. Long-range planning became possible. Coordinated operations became practical. Precision strikes replaced area bombing. The modern military's reliance on sensors, satellites, and data networks traces directly to Watt's insight that information advantage determines victory. But Watt also left a warning. In his final interview before death, conducted in 1972, Watt was asked what advice he would give future scientists developing defense technologies. Watt said, "Convince the bureaucrats early. Don't wait for crisis. By the time the threat is obvious, it's too late to develop countermeasures. Development takes years. Deployment takes years. If you wait for war to start building systems, you'll fight blind. And people will die, thousands of them. Not because the technology failed, because the investment came too late." The interviewer asked if Watt had any regrets. Watt was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "I regret that I didn't fight harder in 1936 and 1937 when the Air Ministry cut our funding. I accepted their decisions. I thought I could prove radar's value gradually, and they would eventually commit fully. But gradual proof meant gradual deployment, and gradual deployment meant incomplete coverage, and incomplete coverage meant dead civilians. If I could go back, I would refuse to accept no. I would demand full funding. I would threaten to resign. I would make noise, because 26,000 lives were worth making noise for." Watt paused. "But I didn't know that in 1936. I only knew it in 1941, when I counted the bodies." Watt's radar system is preserved at the Imperial War Museum in London, the original receiver from the 1935 Daventry demonstration, the oscilloscope that displayed the first aircraft detection. The equipment that proved radio waves could see the invisible. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage electronics equipment: brown metal boxes, vacuum tubes, tangled wires. Nothing suggests this equipment saved a nation, but it did. In February of 1935, when Watt powered up that receiver and saw a spike appear on the oscilloscope screen, he saw the future. A future where aircraft couldn't hide, where surprise attacks became impossible, where defenders had time to respond. He saw Britain's survival, and he spent the next 5 years trying to convince others to see it too. Some listened, some didn't. The ones who didn't killed 26,000 people through their skepticism. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just incrementally, through budget cuts, delayed decisions, and gradual deployments that weren't fast enough. Watt never forgave them, but he understood them. Because sometimes the hardest thing to believe is that an invisible threat can be defeated by an invisible solution, until the solution proves itself. And by then, it's too late for the people who died waiting. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about scientists who saved nations, real people, real innovations. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family worked on radar or served in the RAF. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Robert Watt doesn't disappear into silence. These innovators deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.